Welcome back to Manufacturing Unscripted. My guest today is Doug Longenecker. Doug's the founder of NKST, and we talked about bridging the gap between strategy and execution at various companies. We also talked about AI and how it can be implemented within these companies. We hope you enjoy.
This podcast is sponsored by Promus Incorporated, the leading provider of fully electric servo presses for manufacturing. Promus provides global support for pressing and motion control applications in multiple industries. With precise positioning and in-process force monitoring, your company will begin to see ROI on day one. Call 810-229-9334 or email sales@promusinc.com to speak with an expert engineer about your application today.
Welcome back to Manufacturing Unscripted. I'm your host, Peter Parsons, and today my guest is Doug Longenecker, founder of NKST. Nice to have you on the show, Doug.
Peter, thanks. It's great to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So before we get started, would you just be able to introduce yourself and introduce your company?
Sure. My name is Doug Longenecker. I'm the founder of NKST, and the best way to frame NKST, I think, for me, is we're a sense of what I could call a convergency, and that is a company that really helps our clients understand how and why and where their strategy makes execution real. And to get a little bit more into that, it's the convergency side comes from my professional background of being in growing up career-wise in advertising agencies in Philadelphia and New York, and then getting on the strategic consulting side of the business. So I've seen it from both sides of the industry, and it felt like there's an opportunity to have both of those elements and components and the best of both worlds of strategic consultancy and creative communications agency come together without any legacy issues, legacy processes, procedures, and probably most importantly, legacy mindsets of how those two operate, bring them together as a startup and from scratch, create a culture that is integrated across all components.
Yeah. And when you went and founded this company, was this more so kind of a way to use your skill set, or do you think it was more so because you saw a need for this?
Great question. I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think I would have seen the need had I not had the experiences on both sides. And I guess in 2018, when this was kind of gestating and formulating in my mind, there was a lot of movement with consultancies were getting into the agency space, and agencies were getting into the consultancy space, and vice versa. But none of them at the time seemed to be doing it really well, and a lot of that's because of they had their own way of doing things, and it didn't always match. And I think some companies have kind of gotten through that and over that. But at the time, it seemed to me like, hey, this is a great opportunity. If we could bring this together from the ground and build it from the ground up, it would be a great competitive advantage.
Yeah. And maybe just to go kind of further in on your company, but what is it that really kind of sets you guys apart? And maybe is there like a certain focus that you guys have, or a certain kind of what's your wheelhouse?
Yeah. The wheelhouse, from my perspective, and I think what makes us different from either a consultancy or a straight up agency, is we are able to start in that continuum from business and brand strategy all the way through execution. And that's nothing really new necessarily, but consultancies typically will help develop the plan. And then and I've seen it a lot of times, and I've been even at a former colleague of mine who is on client side now, and in the bookshelf behind him is one or two giant binders from big consultancies of their playbook of what they need to do. But it's so I guess so vast and so like high level, they're not sure how to implement. And that's the difference, that we can break down our recommendations and then take it all the way through operations and execution.
Yeah. So maybe not necessarily just giving this giant, thick plan of, this is every step that you need to do to benefit your company, but kind of being more smaller, like actionable items.
Exactly. And we will identify the problems, prioritize those issues and the solutions around them. And look, some companies do just want to take it on and go ahead and do it themselves, and we're happy to do that. Take it that far and then kind of let it go. But for companies that also need help executing, we can then come in and help get between those nooks and crannies of silos and help bring them together to be able to facilitate the execution of those plans.
Yeah. And maybe to tie it back to manufacturing, but a lot of manufacturing companies, I mean, they're running 24 hours a day. They have, really tight lead times. They have these really important deliverables that they always have to constantly be meeting. And I know in that industry, change is a pretty difficult thing to come by. It's something that's inevitable, but it is something that, you might get a lot of pushback on. At least with manufacturing companies specifically, how do you kind of navigate that challenge of, maybe recommending improvements and changes to their existing process while balancing that need to kind of keep the lights on?
Yeah, great question. So we don't come at it as, hey, we're experts in any one particular field, although we do have expertise in lots of areas. We understand that every industry is a dynamic industry and is changing and evolving. And if we just came in with a preset sort of solution, we know that's not necessarily going to, it could work, but might not be the best solution. So we're going to come in and go through a pretty thorough discovery session with executive leadership, key players. And again, it depends on the situation and it depends on the business. Even do focus groups with kind of rank and file employees to get a sense of how's it look on the ground compared from the executive suite, and facilitate those conversations. But then also there's a readout with executive leadership to help them understand, hey, where you thought you were really aligned? Well, you are, or maybe you're not. And so there's the validation if they're right, and then there's also a potential for correction, as you noted, if there is a disconnect. But the idea is to find those common threads and be able to elevate them and find the disconnects and eliminate those.
Yeah. And specifically with that disconnect, kind of between the executives and the shop floor, I guess, is there a way that you kind of try to navigate bridging that gap, or is that kind of solely on the responsibility of the executives?
Well, and actually sometimes there's disconnect amongst executive team members too. So that's always an interesting dynamic to help facilitate. But I think in that scenario of with the executive leadership team might have a disconnect, they don't always have the ability or have the time to be able to facilitate conversations around differences. So that's one way we can come in and help. But our process that I was describing from discovery is one that is inclusive. So they're all in the process together. So again, they are experiencing or learning our findings almost in real time, and we don't really sugarcoat a lot of it based on particular politics or dynamics. It is what it is from our observations and our conversations with all the different constituencies within the company, within that particular project. And then, if they're not a company that really wants to work through those problems, it becomes very evident, and both sides will move on. If they're like, wow, this is really holding us back, we didn't realize that, then and they're willing to make change, then it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. And then is that kind of following the idea where you're not necessarily just saying, here are the changes that you need to make and then you're good forever, but it's kind of more of kind of teaching them how to go through and make those changes and to kind of enable themselves to kind of be self-improving, even past your consultation?
Yeah, and now what you're getting into is almost a bit of culture, sort of change, transformation, perhaps, because if they've gotten here, let's say over the last 20, 25 years, and a lot of companies, in spite of themselves, do really well, but we're starting to getting into a period where what worked before is probably not going to work as well, or it might not even work at all moving forward. So it's really important that those companies understand that it's not just maybe this particular solution in time, but as you're alluding to, it's how do they keep looking internally to be able to realize, hey, there's some slippage here, there's drag, there's a leak, or there's fragmentation between the overall business strategy and how it gets implemented into operations and maybe executed on a communications side of things.
Yeah. And I guess with that idea, do you ever run into times where I guess kind of the company culture just it's too stagnant. It's not really able to change. And, you have these recommendations, but it, ultimately doesn't end up working?
Sure. I mean, that's the kind of the nature of the beast, I guess. Not every company is willing or even able to be able to make that kind of that big of a leap that you're talking about. And but more than likely they'll be forced into some degree of change, with or without us on board.
Yeah. I guess kind of on the other end, not to kind of look at maybe a failure of change, but what are some like success stories that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, so more recently, I've worked with some manufacturing companies in polyolefin foam and thermoplastics, and they've got some unique, really cool stories to tell. And one was dealing with a merger and acquisition, and another one was a new product launch. So I'll start with a new product launch. So they had a new rollout for foam. They did the CapEx investment, got the machinery and the training of personnel in that machinery, and we were involved in helping them with a go-to-market strategy. And it was really interesting because in talking with and understanding what their sales discipline is and how they've positioned their other foams in the past, we were able to go pretty deep in their value chain of selling. And what was unique, we were able to uncover like there's a whole different and new target segment that perhaps could be very fruitful, maybe not in the actual purchase, but a very strong influencer on the people who do make that pull the trigger on purchasing and buying. But there was a bit of resistance just because that was just a new target segment and no one had ever reached out to them. And there's different messaging, different triggers that you've got to be able to accommodate for. So we're able to do a lot of different training, not so much one-on-one, but really group dynamics of teaching them like the specific messaging and how to introduce that. But then also like fishbowl experiments where it would role playing and be able to stop that conversation in real time and course correct a little bit if there's something was going off, or even stop it to say, hey, that was awesome, what you did there was just fantastic, and everybody should take note.
Yeah. And maybe along the lines, when looking at like new market segments or new opportunities, is that a pretty common thing that you see across industries where people may not be necessarily trying to expand or maybe plan for the future, but are kind of more so kind of stuck in the here and now?
To be honest, it's a mixed bag. I mean, there are some companies and executive leadership teams that are really on it, and they know where they are now, and let's say they've been doing pretty well from a business standpoint, but they know the next 5 years they've got to get there. And there are some companies that might not understand that so much. And I have a previous example, not with Next, but when I was working on the consulting side, of a family-owned business, and but it was sizable, and it's been around for 30 years. The owner was and CEO was starting to get calls for an acquisition and was really not happy with the valuation at all, especially because over the last 5 years they had just doubled top line revenue, and that was something they were very proud of. But when that person was thinking about it, they weren't really sure about how they did it. So, so some people could just be frustrated by that whole situation, just like keep moving forward, and we're going to do what we do because it seemed to work. We don't know exactly what it was, but let's keep going forward. But this person was more of a visionary and said, if I want to sell this in the next 5 or 10 years, and I want the valuation to be higher, I've got to really understand this. So we were brought in to not just work with him, but each of the department heads to work and figure out, okay, what happened in the last 5 years? What was happening? What did they feel worked? What did they feel didn't work? And looking forward, what do they need to stop doing? But really helping them and facilitating the individual department heads how to reimagine, how to rethink what they need to do to hit that goal moving forward. And it was one-on-ones with those department heads. It was group meetings, so they weren't doing it in their own little island or in their own silo. They could understand, like, okay, operations is going to be doing this. That means sales and marketing need to do something over here. That means pricing, which is in that business, it was a very volatile pricing schedule, almost day to day. Just the conversations that came out of that, to see them starting to come together to help build this kind of from the bottom up, so to speak. Even though they were still required to go on and do their everyday required workflows to keep the business going.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with, especially, when you're talking about, these executives, a lot of things, it's just so hard to learn without, actually going through and, getting that real world experience. So, I mean, is that kind of part of that, it's like an additional level of training for these executives?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, I hate to say it depends, but I think it really does. One, you've got to be an executive that's open enough to say and admit, wow, I don't know everything, or I don't know what I don't know. And sometimes as you get further into your career, that becomes harder and harder to do, just to stay open like that. You might be a younger executive and think you've seen it all when you really haven't. And I'm probably on that older spectrum, but and I've seen a lot, but I know I haven't seen everything that there is coming down the pike. So I think that's the key for executive teams, is just to be really open to understanding that you may have been in an industry for 30 years and you think you've seen everything, you understand it all, but there are always new things to get involved with and understand. And I think one of those components now, I don't think it's anything new or surprise for anybody, but when you think about artificial intelligence going from generative AI, and the hype around that, and then starting to transition and evolve into agentic AI, that is just creating, again, another level of hype. But now it's another level of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, and it's one of those things, everyone's, they're trying to get a piece of it. They're trying to see how they can incorporate it and use it. And, for a lot of people, it's kind of like the Wild West. Nobody really knows what to do and, how to really implement it. They just kind of all know that they do want it, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you hit the nail on the head. It is a Wild West out there. And there are a lot of great prepackaged off the shelf solutions for certain industries, for certain aspects of their business. And then there's also, validation and credence to, building something from scratch. And, but I don't think a lot of purveyors of AI it's a wild west, but it's also a potential gold rush. And
Yeah.
as on the company sides, you got to start sorting. It's hard to sort and sift through all that, like you were saying, and understand what's real, what's bogus, and what's just hype. And that's we come at it from a standpoint of you need to get involved, you need to get engaged, and have some degree of knowledge. And what you were talking about, executive leadership just can't say yes, AI, we want it, we need it, and then expect department heads to be able to understand what that means, because the direction is just so nebulous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what's the relationship that Next has with AI and kind of its use and implementation?
Yeah, well, last year we conducted, man, like 50 different one-on-one executive, one-on-one AI for business training for executives, and that was some of it was an eye opener, but it was more validation just of what you were saying. It is the Wild West from the sales side, but from the buying side, it is all over the map too in terms of their executives' understanding of AI, how to use it on their own like personal side or individual part of the business, let alone the scale it for the whole company. And our point of view on that is you can't just buy into the hype as an organization, and more than likely organizations aren't nearly as behind as they feel they are. And because things are moving so fast, it's almost impossible, especially if you're looking at mid-market or large small businesses, because they don't always have the investment structure to be getting involved as maybe as heavily as they would like to. And our counsel is take a beat, and before you can still have your some individual kind of workflow stuff going on, but make sure your data and IT stack are aligned and ready to go, and start thinking about governance around that data, because all these AI workflows, whether it's generative or agents, are going to be sitting on top of that data. And when we get into agentic AI, and now they're being asked to make decisions, and even interacting with another agent and making decisions. If that data is not structured correctly, or it's old, or it's not integrated well enough, then there's going to be some major problems.
Yeah. And I think, too, a lot of people, they rush in without having that firm foundation, kind of like you were saying. And one of the things a lot of people don't necessarily consider as much is the vulnerability that they'll have in terms of like cybersecurity.
Yes.
It's something where people are rushing to the front of the line to incorporate the AI to get it integrated into their systems, but they might not necessarily realize, if I'm connecting everything to this agent or to this database, do I know for sure that what I'm connecting it to is solid, secure, and it's not going to end up, costing me down the line in terms of my vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're running on the cloud versus some on-prem server. And those are some, as you mentioned, those are some big, heavy questions that an organization really needs to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's something, too, a lot of people are kind of scrambling a bit to kind of play catch up in that specific area for cybersecurity, going through and actually making sure, like, okay, do all of our employees actually understand cybersecurity? Are they going to, while we're asking them to, learn these new tools and incorporate these new aspects into their workforce, are we also making sure that they have that foundation of knowledge? So I guess it kind of comes twofold, where you want the foundation for the AI, but you also want the foundation for your employees.
Yes, definitely. And to that point, our head of data and AI, he was just a couple months ago, he was with a very large company and doing just that, training to employees. And it was very interesting because they were a Microsoft company, So Copilot is embedded into everything, and every person had access to that, which was just kind of astounding, because some people are off, creating their own personal, AI workflows with Copilot, but there's there, I, to the best of our knowledge, there was not a real good security around that. So if when that workflow is going outside of the system to get information to help them do their work for whatever it was, even if it's just like deep research, there's a potential security leak there.
Yeah, yeah, and just not only in terms of security of the AI itself or the database themselves, but these tools are also now accessible to people who may be bad actors in this space, and people who
Hmm.
are looking to either ransom data or hack into different networks and things like that. So not only do you have to learn how to make sure these tools you use are secure, but you also have to be able to kind of safeguard and protect yourself.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I mean, this particular issue might be the one that actually slows down all the hype that is
Yeah.
going on, especially as more and more companies are starting to figure out it's not this race to be efficiencies, because they're never going to be able to save enough money to the prosperity level that they're looking for, and they've got to find a way to balance that efficiency with how are they being effective.
Yeah.
And from our perspective, that means making sure you've got what we call HI, but human involvement, human interaction. So when you're building out that AI workflow, where's the checkpoints? At the very least, where are the checkpoints for humans to make sure that what's being processed is correct?
Yeah. And I think we're still in a space where, you really don't necessarily want to have, something generated by an agent or an AI. You don't necessarily want to have that going directly to a customer yet. You still want to have that, human filter.
Yes, yeah, and I find that a lot in manufacturing and even I guess in financial services where the businesses are really built on strong customer relationships. And it seems like a lot of companies are doing everything they can to take that element out. And I guess there's areas where I guess it makes sense. And if you look at population segments or demographics as those groups move through life, it will be changing. But right now, companies need to be able to provide different or alternate ways of being connected. And that kind of lends into just the whole customer experience. Like, how present is the company in all these different consumer or customer behaviors in terms of how they consume information, how they consume media, and that's just a whole other door to walk through in terms of how companies assess that and see where they truly are in that realm and where they think they need to be.
Yeah. And especially too, you have all this noise and all this, like you said, the hype that's kind of bouncing around where, a company providing an AI agent might show up at your door and say, we can save you this much money. We can, replace this many employees by just using our systems. And, it's one of those things where sometimes it just sounds too good to be true. And it almost
Yeah.
kind of is because, there's those hidden costs to, removing those employees. You may be streamlining this process in a certain way, but there's other things that you lose out on.
Yes, exactly. And then also you find a lot of companies who have done that, but then 6 months later, they're hiring people back because they realized, wow, this isn't as great as what we were told it was going to be, or it is, but we don't like we don't like that end result because we've taken people out of the mix here.
Yeah.
And that's understanding who you are as a company and your culture. I work with a lot of manufacturers where it is that human connection between sales and people, customers and clients, is critical. And I'd like to think that's going to continue, but it's just going to continue in different ways. It might not always be, through a phone call and going out for lunch, or taking people out to some entertainment venue for like a ball game or something like that. It's going to definitely change, but there still needs to be that somehow a human connection to the company. And I say that even with the knowledge of there are going to be agents, there's going to be buyers agents and sellers agents at some point talking to one another, but I don't think we're really close to that at this point.
Yeah, and one of the things I was going to ask, and you kind of already answered it, but kind of what areas are going to be most impacted by the implementation of these agents? And I think, like you were saying, having these buying and selling agents, kind of taking the place of a lot of these salespeople, and kind of the more traditional ways of networking and making connections.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see companies try to balance that going forward of keeping that human connection involved, whereas, it is cheaper, more efficient, and sometimes quicker to, employ these agents?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not really sure. And I don't know if anybody really is. It is going to, at some point, that shift is going to happen. And even I think now, that dynamic is shifting. Not everyone wants to be bothered with a phone call. Not everyone wants to be taken out and wined and dined because everyone's time is so precious. And to take that for a sales call to go out to lunch, now that means everything else backed up at my desk or my office, and now I'm going to have to stay late or work half day on Saturday just to get through all this. So I wish I could answer it, but I don't know if anybody can. If they can, I don't think they're probably going to be that accurate. But it's a great question. It's something that we all need to be contemplating and thinking about as we go through this evolution.
Yeah, and I think too, just having that being in the front of the mind, having that being something you're actively kind of evaluating and monitoring, and it's something that almost every industry is going to have to kind of navigate this together.
Mm-hmm.
And, at some point someone's going to be the first, and then it's going to kind of trickle down. But, slowly it's going to be something that everyone's keeping an eye out for. And, we're going to see what succeeds and what doesn't.
Exactly. And that's a really good point. And as an organization, as a business, you can sit around and wait to see what happens, what comes to the top. Or you can get involved and you can get engaged with the technology and start to figure it out and tinker with it and just kind of test and learn, maybe in smaller pockets of your business, just so your teams start to get a grasp on what's going on, and even to help them start thinking, okay, this technology isn't just meant to bolt onto our existing processes and procedures. It's meant to open up the door for us to rethink and reimagine how we as a company create value, and also how we provide new value to our customers, and how we're doing things now with the aid of this technology of AI. How does that change how we design our own internal processes moving forward? And that's the exciting part for me. I mean, I think that starts to be really cool for any company to be able to start to kind of figure out how to get out of their own way, to be able to create something or evolve to something new.
Yeah, and along those lines, I know it's obviously going to depend on the company, but based on kind of your philosophy, what would you say is better? Would it be better to be, that first person kind of taking the leap, taking the risk, or is it better to kind of hold back and see what sifts to the top?
Yeah, I think every company needs to take stock of where they are, both internally from a tech side, internally from a talent side, and then with that talent and people side, what's their culture like? And that will help prioritize where they need to start first. And it might not just be one or the other. Maybe there's within those three kind of buckets, maybe it's a little bit here, a little more in this one, and then maybe nothing over here. I mean, that permutation is going to vary, but that's where we help companies come in with an outside perspective the outside in perspective. And because we've worked in with manufacturing, we have a little bit of the inside out. So that gives us more of a holistic way to look at it and more objective way to look at it. And when companies can really, like I said, take a step back, take that beat and say, okay, we're going to look internally to figure out how do we do this? How do we move forward? There's best practices, yes, but maybe not all those best practices fit for us.
Yeah,
and feel free for them to design their AI roadmap again on what makes sense for them in this moment. And it's not to say they have to stick to that map. That can evolve and change as well.
Yeah. Well, Doug, I want to just thank you for joining us here today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Before we go, I just have one last question that I kind of want to ask. And I guess that's kind of, what are maybe two extremes that you've seen, working with companies where maybe there's a company you've gone in and, they're already working, as good as they can be, and there's really nothing that you can do versus, you walk in and everything's on fire and it's a question of, where do I even begin?
That's a great question. So, give me a second to think on that one. So we've got the two extremes of, hey, they've got all systems go. They're moving, and then we got the ones who don't or maybe aren't even aware of what's going on around them. Do you mean with AI or just in general of keeping up with the competition in the market?
I mean, I kind of meant in general, but I mean, if there's something specific to AI too, I'm sure that's, there's a lot more volatility there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So that example I shared before with the company that had doubled their top line revenue in 5 years, they were doing everything they knew how to do. They just didn't know how it all worked together to create this wonderful result. And so I think that's may not be extreme. Maybe that's the middle. The more I think about it, and I've worked with some electronics manufacturers who they kind of in spite of themselves still really we're doing well. I don't know if I can really answer that. I feel bummed here at the end. I can't pull in these two extremes, but they're out there. And I think if you are a company that is not thinking about anything, just plodding ahead, doing what you're doing, there's trouble ahead. And something cataclysmic needs to happen for that executive team to start rethinking what they're doing, even if what they're doing is working right now, because what's coming down the pike, it's going to be harder and harder for them to continue to do that. And companies that are firing all cylinders, they're the ones that are going to grasp and understand what AI can do for them and what it can't do for them. They're going to be able to understand and see through the hype versus the reality. And those are the companies who probably know themselves well enough to know and understand how to incorporate that into a more workable solution that's going to help them get started, but also evolve and go further faster.
Yeah. And maybe one of the big takeaways that I've gotten is just, it might not be apparent to a company that you need that kind of outside perspective. And, there can be these cracks forming, far from the eyes of the C-suite. And you can always kind of, there's always value in having that kind of outside opinion and outside counsel.
Yeah. And those cracks and those leaks, like you mentioned, they will be happening. They'll be coming more larger and more potentially devastating. And more than likely, they might not even feel it first. The customers are probably going to notice it and feel it and experience it first. And that's when those organizations are going to feel it in sales. And then they'll what typically happens, they'll diagnose, we got a problem with sales or marketing. And you know what? It might be with operations and customer experience or employee training. or elsewhere along that chain.
Yeah. So once again, thank you for joining me here today. It's been a pleasure hearing from you. So for any companies out there that want to hear from you or want to get in touch with Next, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
LinkedIn is always a viable channel. I'm a heavy user on LinkedIn. You can hit me up there. You can hit me up with the email, doug.l@whatsnext.com. It's WHATSNKST.com. And happy to start a conversation.
All right. Well,
and
thank
Peter,
you.
I just want to say thanks for having me on. I enjoyed our conversation, and looking forward to the future for all businesses as they wrestle and figure out how to utilize AI in the best way possible.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And thank you to all the listeners out there tuning in week after week. Until next time, we'll see you then.
This podcast is brought to you by Promise Incorporated. Hosted by Peter Parsons, produced by Lauren Rawl, and mixed and edited by Ben Parsons. If you have any questions or would like to appear on the podcast, please reach out to podcast@promiseinc.com. Thanks for listening.